Timothy Ferris here with a few words about the words Newton's sleep. They come from a poem written by William Blake, which reads, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." He was referring, of course, to Isaac Newton, the great scientist, mathematician, and polymath, widely considered to be the most intelligent human known to history, who had died 30 years prior to Blake's birth, and whose influence over the world had been enormous in those 30 years and in the preceding years after Newton had written his famous works on gravitation and optics and such. His thought had become so pervasive in Europe that Voltaire in France wrote that a knowledge of science had become a prerequisite to being accepted into polite society. Voltaire himself wrote a book about Newton. Now, they were very different people. Blake was a visionary. He worshipped really the imagination. He created a complex system of the way he saw the world. He said, I must either create my own system or be trapped in another man's. But he was no crank. He was an astoundingly perceptive painter, engraver, and writer who, working what we today would call poverty, did much of his work on very small scales because he couldn't afford much in the way of materials. He was sociable, well-liked. He may even have met Tom Paine, who was in London social circles for a while at the same time. And Blake, for all of his religious belief, never really condemned Tom Paine, who was being attacked by the church as an atheist. Paine, was the writer of Common Sense and other books that had inspired Americans during their revolution against the British, also an inspirational force in the French Revolution. Paine was being widely attacked by church figures for being an atheist, which wasn't quite correct, but certainly not a devout believer, and whose philosophy, liberalism really, church authorities saw as threatening the primacy of religion in the world. Blake remarked that it was easier for a bishop to just simply have what we today would call a knee-jerk reaction against Paine than for a believing Christian to read what Paine had written and think it through for him or herself. Newton was a very different sort of a man, one of the most solitary individuals known to history. Newton was the son of an illiterate yeoman who died before Newton was born, and a semi-literate mother who quickly married another man, as many women had to do in those days. Women had very little protection or ability, even legal right, to live alone and expect to raise their children properly. As often happened, the man that Newton's mother married was not up to Newton's standards. He was sent as a troublesome adolescent to be raised by a relative nearby. He could look out and see the house where his mother lived with the usurper, and grew up as an angry and depressed man, rendered solitary to some degree by his enormous intellect, but also by circumstances in which he simply did not feel happy with the lot that he'd been given in life. He fought with other children. He had lots of conflicts in school. The schoolwork, as you might imagine, didn't inspire him all that much. And he confessed to having fantasies of burning down the house in which his mother and stepfather lived, and them with it. When Newton went off to Cambridge, the locals are said to have cheered him on, saying he was fit for nothing but the versity. Blake was a sociable man with lots of friends, famous for he and his beautiful wife liking to sunbathe in the nude in their little garden. Lots of friends came by to visit them for the conversation, I suppose, but it seems to have been a happy circumstance. So why did the talented Blake, an imaginative man who saw angels in the trees and faces in clouds from an early age, say something so condemnatory about Newton? Why did he speak of single vision and Newton's sleep? The answer wasn't that Newton was an atheist like Paine or anything of that sort. Newton also believed that God existed and that God had created the universe. Newton thought you couldn't really understand the universe without seeing it as a creation of God. Neither Newton nor Blake yet knew how, for instance, stars and planets are formed or how life evolved, information that might have helped change their perspective a bit, but wouldn't have come along until the days of Charles Darwin. But the center of Blake's universe was his own imagination and the beauties of imagination and creativity, and he feared that science had no room for such things, that it reduced the world to a kind of machine. Blake wrote that God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. You might say roughly that he saw himself rightly as one of those who dwell in the light of day, but Newton as an inhabitant of the darkness. Blake himself was hardly a dark writer. His work is full of memorable phrases. He was an amazing poet. He's the one who wrote what became kind of an anthem of the hippies back in the 60s, that you never know what is enough until you know what is more than enough. He wrote the marvelous words, "How do you know but that every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed by your senses 5." That's a remarkable observation. I think about it all the time. It reminds us that the way we categorize the world affects the way we see it, and the way we see it automatically excludes other perspectives. As we've come to know more about animals, for instance, we're beginning to realize the enormity of the universe of knowledge and activity among animals that we just don't yet understand or sympathize with or begin to appreciate. But Blake appreciated all that. Blake was also not a doctrinaire person. As I said earlier, he invented his own form of belief. It was part of Christianity, but he wasn't interested in simply repeating dogma because someone had taught it to him. He wrote, "The man who never alters his opinion is like standing water and breeds reptiles of the mind. Energy," he said, "is eternal delight." Newton might have agreed about that one. But Blake feared that science would replace the richly imaginative world that he saw all around him, a world full of the unknown as well as the known, with a single vision that only saw what was already known and established under science. And what little science did know by that time did kind of seem that way. You could see how it might have become a kind of one-dimensional thought, the same sort of thought that Blake disapproved of in religious dogmatists. From Blake's work came the romantic tradition that we saw in the hippies, and it's still popular, particularly with younger people today. It was a romantic contention that imagination was superior to reason, which at that stage of reason, if we think of reason in terms of the state of mathematics and science, you could still sort of make a case for that. And against science, which they saw as narrowly logical and deductive rather than inductive, I guess, and somehow not as open to the world as the romantics were. As one romantic put it, "All scientific knowledge, which is symbolized by the serpent in paradise, confuses the mind and is liable to abuse." Blake went so far as to write that art is the tree of life and science the tree of death. These ideas have persisted down to the modern day in the form of vague sensibilities along the lines of imagination being superior, every person's personal vision being a kind of truth, and emotions somehow counting for more than facts. But such views find substantially less foundation now that science has had a couple of centuries to keep working its magic. And we can begin to see that the real force of imagination is nature's, that human imagination is one part in an enormous, perhaps infinite variety of imaginative forces operating throughout the universe, and we should think among many different sorts of living creatures as well. It was science, not poetry, that showed us that life has emerged in all of its amazing complexity, all sorts of things that no one ever did imagine, and I suppose because they couldn't imagine them until they saw such a thing, through the simple operations of evolution, which does no planning, has no creativity in mind, but is simply a matter of replication of existing structures, some errors of replication occurring, and some of those errors, a small subset of them, promoting the survival of those creatures or plants, whatever, containing the erroneous information over the survival of those who had the prior form of genetic information. It is really kind of magical the way such simple mechanisms can produce such a universe of imaginative and diverse creations, from Newton's theories to Blake's etchings and poems. Last night here at the observatory, I was imaging a quasar 8 billion light years away. If someone were alive in the galaxy that contained that quasar back at the time that that light was emitted, and that person were to train some super telescope here on our galaxy with high resolution, they could pick out planets and such, they would not see our planet, Earth, because 8 billion years ago, the Earth hadn't come into being. The sun and its planets would not exist from the standpoint of that observer for another 4 billion years. If we were to play the old game of having a dinner party and who would you invite from history, it'd be nice to invite Newton and Blake here to the observatory, have a look at that quasar and all the other wonders out in the depths of the universe. I think that might have stimulated both their imagination, and about the beauty of imaginative, creative work, they might well have agreed. Thanks for listening. See you next time.